On Friday on the program, we had Cenk Uygur. He is running for California's 25th district, I think it is, if I'm served correctly, my memory, which would be shocking at this point. And he is running for Congress there in Katie Hill's now open seat. He is running against a very much an establishment Democrat, one coming from the California State House, backed by all the people who don't want this seat filled by someone who is going to be a problem for the Democratic establishment in any way. And the one thing that I can guarantee you about Cenk Uygur is he will be a problem for the Democratic establishment. And to the extent that he will be a problem, it will not be, well, I mean, in my most cynical hours, I think a reliable vote who will vote with Republicans a certain percentage of the time is very helpful to the Democratic establishment. He will not, but ostensibly is a problem. He will not be one of those. He will be one who is consistently voting with the most progressive Congress people in the House, without a doubt. I mean, I don't know what you would use as the benchmark, but somewhere between Ro Khanna and AOC, if you were to use their votes as a benchmark, I would imagine he will, he would get a A+ rating if that was going to be the scorecard.
Yeah, including on foreign policy as well.
Yeah, that's why I say those two guys, because I think,
Definitely.
that covers a lot of the sort of the ground.
Yeah.
But over the years, have there been things on his show that I'm not a fan of? Yes, because it's not my show. And there is no show that exists wherein I look at it and say, I'm not a fan of that part of it. Because, in fact, for the most part, I don't watch other shows because I don't, on some level, want to be influenced by what other people are doing. And I generally it's just in my nature to just be like, for the most part, I'm just doing it exactly right, and everyone else is not. But that aside, I mean, I'm just being honest.
No, I appreciate the transparency, and I also appreciate the beautiful delusion of it.
Well, yeah, and I recognize there's a certain amount of delusion of it, and I understand there's a certain amount of narcissism, and it's said with a little bit of irony. Now, that may be a problem.
Right.
If the New York Times was ever to write about me.
Said he did everything perfect.
Because they would write, Sam Seder thinks he is perfect and that everyone else is flawed. And we know this because he said something like that. And in fact, well, let's go directly to this. So Bernie Sanders essentially retracted his endorsement of Cenk in a combination of Cenk deciding that his show and his, I don't know, million hours of public pronunciations, some of which were, I don't know, in jest, and certainly things he had written on a blog about 15 years ago, very sexist. Now, to his credit, and this came out when he had to part ways with the Justice Democrats, about, I don't know, he wrote this stuff 15 years ago, about 12 years ago or 10 years ago, he deleted it all because he realized this stuff is sexist. And he was formerly a Republican, also not my favorite thing to have been at that time, but that was years ago. And I think by all accounts, people make mistakes.
Growth and evolution
this
are
is,
good things.
this is not like something he said 6 months ago. It's not something he's defending in any way today. None of it. None of that is account. But of course, if you want to go out and smear people and you want to make them toxic, this is the way you do it. And I think he realized, this is going to be problematic for other people, not so much maybe for him, because he has an updated record. But, in the same way, I've been through one of these things, and I will show the analogy in a moment. So Bernie stepped back, and then there was a piece written in the New York Times about it. And this is a perfect example of something that I think is either like despicable or highly problematic with, and maybe both, with really a lot of news organizations, but particularly in this case, the Times. So the paragraph says, Mr. Uygur, a longtime supporter of Mr. Sanders, that I believe is true, has also disparaged former President Barack Obama on his show. Now, disparaged, I think, is a very interesting word to use there because it implies like just, gratuitously insulted Barack Obama, as opposed to has at times been a critic of former President Barack Obama, right? Disparaged is not what you say. Like, you would never say Chris Matthews disparaged Lindsey Graham last night on the show. They would never, ever say that.
He disparaged Tip O'Neill.
It's just a very strange choice of words. And this is the New York Times, right? I mean, disparage means, well, let's just look up what the definition is. To depreciate, to speak slightingly, I guess, to lower in rank or reputation. Now, this is not what he did. He didn't belittle.
To cover President Obama's being soft on Wall Street. It's
right.
Not disparaging somebody.
Right. It is critiquing what the president did. I don't even know if that the New York Times would write that anybody disparaged Donald Trump, right? Then he said, argued that bestiality should be legal. Now, this was, if you watch the piece, they link to it. It is one of those sort of like, we're doing a talk radio show and I'm gonna take a position as basically as a joke.
So obviously, if you are irony dead.
Exactly. But this is where this is the one that's really the most offensive. And hosted white supremacist figures, including David Duke. Okay, now, hosted, this is something you could say about CNN in the past week. And when they host, they really host. Right? Like, they really host. Like, hosted is again implying like, I'm going to be nice and welcome into my home. I'm your host. As opposed to interviewed.
The way you host Libertarian.
Right. The way I hosted Michael, what's his name? Tracy. What's his name? Not Michael Tracy.
Very nice host.
Yeah, Michael Tracy. I hosted him on the show. Right. And in one clip that circulated on Twitter, now this circulated on Twitter by someone who was specifically attacking Cenk Uygur and in support of his political competitor in this 25th district.
I mean, literally misinformation.
Right.
We got to call it what
right. And it's interesting. They will link to the argue that bestiality should be legal, but somehow they couldn't find the David Duke interview, right, in this piece, and they didn't link to that. In one clip that circulated on Twitter, also no link, Mr. Duke ends an interview by saying, "I am not what you call a racist," to which Mr. Uygur replies, No, of course not. Now, I say it that way because we're just reading it. They don't link to it, so we don't know the tone. It could have been, no, of course not. Very credulously, or like, yeah, no, of course not. Now, and wait, put it back on there. Put it back. Mr. Uygur called the clip a complete smear that had been taken out of context from a combative 1-hour interview in which he pushed back on Mr. Duke. Now, the idea that they wrote that paragraph in there shows me consciousness of guilt. They know they are reprinting a smear, but they want to be able to say, but we allowed him to address this. We didn't link to it. We, as the New York Times, a multi-million-dollar business dedicated to finding the truth could not make this assessment. So we are going to present the charge not as a claim or an assertion, but as a fact. TikTok, voice of God. And I know this because I've actually been on the other side of how you do this with reporters. We're going to present in one clip that's circulated on Twitter. No, we are not making any subjective analysis of this at all. This is God speaking. God looks down and tells you it's a clip on Twitter. Mr. Duke ends an interview by saying, quote, "I am not what you call a racist," end quote, to which Mr. Uygur replies, "No, of course not," end quote. God has spoken. But now we'll let God steps out of the picture, and Mr. Uygur called the clip a complete smear that had been taken out of context. Mr. Uygur said it had been taken out of context from a combative 1 hour of interview. Mr. Uygur said it was combative. Mr. Uygur said it was 1 hour. We have no way of knowing. We have no way of checking because we're just the New York Times. We don't have computers that link to this stuff on YouTube, even though we linked to the clip about bestiality. So we're going to let you decide. Here is the, let's play first just the snippets of this interview to see if Mr. Uygur was accurate that this was a combative interview. Mr. Uygur said it was. We don't know. We just know that God says. It appears he said, "Of course you're not a racist, Mr. Duke."
Name me one anti-Semitic person.
I say that
you can't.
The Jewish organization.
David, how can you think you're not anti-Semitic? How could you possibly think that you think the Jews control the world? That's anti-Semitism 101.
I'll give you another quotation.
Kagan is on the Supreme Court, but so is Sotomayor, and she's definitely not Jewish. She's Latina. I mean, Kagan made it onto the Supreme Court, but so is Sotomayor. Those are two picks by Obama. Sotomayor, clearly not Jewish. In fact, what is it? I think 7 out of the 9 justices are Catholic. Oh my God, the Catholics have taken over the Supreme Court. Watch out, David. Watch out. It's the Catholics that are the problem. But then you've got the Koch brothers who buy all these politicians. They're not Jewish. How does that fit into your conspiracy theory?
So,
I mean, you keep saying Goldman Sachs, but before Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs was Hank Paulson. Christian extraordinaire. The biggest political contributor in the country is not Sheldon Adelson. It is David and Charles Koch. They are enormously Christian. They're Christian. If you built everything, but somehow you don't have power anymore, you can't even get into the schools you built, why are you guys such losers?
All right. Now, I don't know. I guess we only know that Cenk characterized that as combative.
I mean, ending that interview by saying, "Yeah, sure."
Okay, wait. Here it is. So now, apparently, this is the 3rd time that Cenk tries to end the interview, but David Duke will not sign up.
I watched this when this first aired. It was incredibly awkward.
All right, thank you for coming. But wait. I got something else to say, Cenk. Okay. Here it is. And so here's the end of that interview. Now, ostensibly, according to the voice of God. And this is what they call it. When you write these pieces, what they tell you is we're going to do some, when I get interviewed by a reporter, I say some of this is going to be off the record. Why do I do that? Because I want to give them information that they don't attribute to me, but they just report as if it's the voice of God. And then I go off the record, or I should say on the record, to give my take on it. But if I can tell them, if they use my facts and don't attribute it to me, it has more strength. So here is Cenk saying, why, of course you're not racist. Or, yeah, you're not racist.
They still talk about me practically every day in relation to Trump, in relation to the guy from Louisiana. It's amazing that I don't do many national interviews anymore. I think the reason is because my arguments are very compelling to an awful lot of people. If they sit down and think about what
pause
they
it.
say.
Now, just be clear, because if you're not watching this, you just didn't hear him say, I think I know why you didn't do a bunch of races, and then he goes, agree to disagree. He's now like literally mocking him. Rude. He was rude to David Duke, but we didn't get that across. But continue.
Amazing that I don't do many national interviews anymore. I think the reason is because my arguments are very compelling to an awful lot of people. If they sit down and think about what they say, I think they'll be really surprised.
Okay.
And by the way, I want to make this clear too. I am not what you call a racist.
No,
I am not, because I believe that every people have the right to seek the things that they love, the things that they appreciate, their values, their people, their interests. And I believe that every nation has a right to be free and independent. That's not what the Zionists think.
Okay,
the
this
Zionists
is
who
not a
control
white
our
nation.
foreign policy want to subjugate the entire world. They're trying to almost create a war with Russia today, which would be insane.
This is a secular.
But that's what they're doing.
This is secular.
And we have to break ourselves through this. And I think the Second
All right, we gotta go.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, David, again, third time. Thank you. We appreciate it.
He's just trying to pretend that he's being played. The idea that the New York Times would report this, when Mike Cernovich wanted to smear me and get me fired, he took a tweet that was so obviously satirical, ironic, that within 3 or 4 days, MSNBC had to rehire me. And the reason is particularly for a news outlet. If a news outlet does not have the ability to assess a statement, whether it's written or spoken, to assess its meaning in context, including all of the sort of the fact that we use idioms, the fact that we use body language, the fact that we use sarcasm. If a news organization is not able to do that, then everything becomes fake news. Then the use of idioms, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Why would the politician say that? Is he working with horses? Right? Do you understand where this leads to? And there's only two things that are happening in this failure. One is the New York Times has no editorial staff, and its reporters are completely incapable of assessing ideas like sarcasm or irony, or this was a purposeful smear that the editors either did not care was happening, or were happy to promote. And if that's what the New York Times is pumping out in a situation where we can examine it and see it, how much can we rely in situations that we can't examine it and see it? This is when the public editor signs off.
They stopped having an ombudsman or ombudsperson in 2017.
I mean, this is reprehensible. Regardless of what you think about Cenk, regardless of whether you would prefer the establishment Democrat, regardless of whether you like his TYT show, this is about the New York Times now. And how many other candidates, organizations are they smearing, but we just don't have the ease to which to look to the YouTube channel. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. And if the Times lets this hang out there, it gives you an indication of just how much you can trust them in any of their coverage.
That's 100% right. And I just want to say, even Cenk, the way they use, I want to just say it wasn't that he was taken out of context. It's even more violent and dishonest than that. It's just a pure direct misrepresentation of what was said. And, beyond that, it just strikes me that I think when it comes to commentary and analysis and shows like this, we are better, and generally podcasting, YouTube, whatever, is better than its corporate analogs on mainstream news. And so I don't think there's any problem with people replacing shows like this over shows they would find on cable. In fact, it's infinitely preferable. But the thing that I keep saying is, like, in a healthy society, however you want to define it, you actually do need institutions like the New York Times, theoretically.
Yeah.
You need quote unquote objective journalism in the sense that, yes, there's always biases, and it's always, yes, we have to be sophisticated about it. But you do need actual big budget journalistic outlets that cover things separate from an editorial line. And it's under assault in terms of the business models overall. They're I mean, the New York Times and Washington Post are doing great, but small media is still collapsing all over the place. The ability of people to do investigative journalism is collapsing. And certainly people, I would say, in the authoritarian right tendencies are happy with that. And then people like in the Times, who are so sanctimonious about this stuff, are taking a sledgehammer to their own capacity to fight for and preserve what actually is an important function.
Yep.
Can we just revisit the sexism for a second?
Well, yeah, I was just about to say, I got an IM from somebody specifically about his defense of the Harvard soccer team's, apparently the Harvard soccer team. Well, I mean, go ahead, and then I'll do.
Yeah, that was gross. I mean, they also did a panel on picking up chicks in 2016 that I thought was pretty gross and made me think that maybe these guys had some things left to learn in the area of how you talk about women or think about women in general. But I mean, we all have to make a pragmatic assessment when deciding who to support in an election, right?
Yes.
And if there were a candidate whose policies were as progressive as Cenk's, who never said anything sexist and never pissed me off in that way, then I'd probably go for them. But there's not. So thanks, the guy.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear. In no way am I endorsing or condoning that. And just to be clear on what the Harvard soccer, I didn't see the one that you were talking about, but it sounds gross to me. The Harvard soccer team apparently made some type of list where they rated, I don't know if it was the female soccer team or just women in general.
I believe it was the soccer team. I'm looking at the Jezebel story.
And I don't know if it was like like I would do them list or just like hotness list or whatever it is. Doing stuff like that is, in my mind, incredibly juvenile when it's done by little kids. You know what I mean? When you start to get into college age, it's like now it's just full-on misogynistic and offensive. And I think defending the list, I mean, to be fair, he was saying, I mean, I think I don't want to overstate the fairness part, but just he was saying that, like, because it was private, it's not as bad and this and that. I mean, I think it's bad behavior, and I think it's highly problematic, and I think it's part of a culture that we have, of, you want to call it toxic masculinity, you want to call it just sort of the way that, men are taught to commodify women's bodies, whatnot. And yes, I think he said in that time, like, women talk about men as being hot or affable or whatever it is. It's true. It's just a far bigger problem when it comes to men doing that with women. So I'm not defending, and people can make that assessment about Cenk, in that perspective. Like, if that's the thing that he was defending, he was, in some way defending these college students' list of who was hot, in their Facebook, whatever it was, then yeah.
I think that the ratings had to do with some oral sex likelihood or something.
Oh, all right. Well, I don't know what the specific details of it. I haven't seen that clip, but still, regardless, I mean, whatever it is, it is. And again, I don't know if the policies of his opponent in California's 25th make up for the fact that one time he defended that on his radio show. But there's also, like, you should not, as the New York Times, And that's why, when I talk about this in this context, I'm not necessarily looking to defend his, whether he's a misogynist or not. But when the New York Times basically uses their platform to say that he was supportive of a white supremacist, that to me is far more problematic at the end of the day than the question. I'm not dismissing it, but in terms of if the New York Times is doing this, that to me is a bigger story. The voters can decide in the 25th about whether they can go watch that video or they can go and just read about that. But the idea that he was welcoming David Duke and doesn't think David Duke is racist, and that's the way the New York Times reported at the end of the day, is a far more disturbing story to me.
Yeah, that's disgusting.
And, but yes, to the extent that people want to assess Cenk as misogynistic based upon his response to that Harvard thing, also keep in light that all the women who has worked in that operation say the opposite. I think there are times he says stuff where he puts his foot in his mouth, frankly. But
yeah, I mean, not everybody is born perfect, and we live in a really sexist society, unfortunately, that inculcates people with this kind of attitude from a very young age. And I mean, I understand why he talked about it the way he did, where he was like, yeah, I used to be sexist, then I got better, everything's fine now. That was a long time in the past, because that's how you have to talk about things in this political climate. You can't give them an inch or your enemies will smell blood in the water. At the same time, if he'd said something, I kind of wish he'd said something like, yeah, I'm not perfect, I'm a dude, I'm a bro, but my heart's in the right place and I'm learning and I want to learn, and I've gotten a lot better about it. But I understand that there's not necessarily room for that kind of nuance.
There might be, but nevertheless, I think that yeah, I agree with you. And I just want to make that clear that I think at the end of the day, not in any way saying that, parsing what those Harvard college kids did is wrong, is commendable in any way. He has also been a fierce advocate for women having sovereignty over their own bodies, and a whole host of issues that are indicative of the respect that he has for women, particularly in the sort of
the areas that would be relevant for him as a congressperson. And
exactly.
Perfection does not exist.